he stumbled. Just a slight misstep on the cracked sidewalk outside the grocery store. The paper bag split open, sending canned goods rolling across the pavement like scattered memories. 83 years old, wearing a faded flannel shirt and worn jeans that had seen better decades. His weathered hands shook as he tried to gather the spilled items, his arthritic fingers struggling with each can of soup, each box of crackers that now seemed impossibly heavy. The security guard approached with the swagger of someone drunk on the smallest taste of authority. Young, maybe 25, with muscles that screamed gym membership and an attitude that screamed insecurity. He looked down at the old man scrambling on his hands and knees, collecting his groceries with the desperate urgency of someone who knew this might be his only shopping trip this month. "Hey, old-timer, you can't be doing that here," the guard barked, his voice cutting through the afternoon air like a rusty blade. "This is private property. You're creating a disturbance." The elderly man looked up, confusion clouding his pale blue eyes. Eyes that had seen things no human should ever have to witness. Eyes that had watched friends die in foreign mud while bullets screamed overhead. But the guard didn't see any of that. He saw what society had taught him to see. A burden, an inconvenience, someone disposable. "I'm sorry," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible above the traffic. "I just dropped my groceries. I'll clean it up." But the guard wasn't interested in apologies. He was interested in flexing the only power he'd ever been given in his unremarkable life. "I said move along. We don't want your kind loitering around." "Here. Your kind." Those two words hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into the consciousness of everyone within earshot. A mother pushing a stroller quickened her pace, avoiding eye contact. A businessman checked his phone, suddenly very busy with nothing. A group of teenagers laughed at something on social media, completely oblivious to the human dignity being stripped away just feet from their bubble of indifference. The old man's hands trembled more violently now, not from age or arthritis, but from something deeper, something that reached back through decades of sacrifice, through years of service, through nights of nightmares that still visited him in his sleep. He had fought for this country when it called. He had bled for these people when they needed him. And now, in his golden years, when he needed them most, he was being treated like garbage on the street. "Please," he said, his voice cracking like autumn leaves. "I just need to pick up my food." But the security guard was done with conversation. He placed his hand on the old man's shoulder, not gently, not with the respect due to someone who had lived through 8 decades of American history. He pushed. Not hard enough to knock him down, but hard enough to send a message. Hard enough to make it clear that this old man's dignity meant nothing to him. The few cans the elderly man had managed to collect rolled away again, his face flushed with shame, not for himself, but for what his country had become. For what these people had become. He had once been willing to die for strangers, and now strangers couldn't even show him basic human decency. But this wasn't just any old man being humiliated on a Tuesday afternoon outside a grocery store in small-town America. This wasn't just another invisible senior citizen being pushed around by someone young enough to be his grandson. The faded flannel shirt hid scars that told stories of courage. The worn jeans covered legs that had carried him through hell and back. And the trembling hands that struggled to hold on to canned soup had once held rifles in defense of freedom itself. What happened next would change everything. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the universe has a way of reminding us that heroes don't stop being heroes just because they get old. And sometimes, the very people we've forgotten are the ones who deserve our remembrance most. The old man's name was Frank Morrison, though nobody at that grocery store knew it. Nobody knew that 60 years earlier, he had been Staff Sergeant Morrison of the 1st Infantry Division. Nobody knew that he had stormed beaches, cleared bunkers, and saved lives when saving lives meant crawling through machine gun fire to drag wounded soldiers to safety. Nobody knew that the Purple Heart gathering dust in his bedroom drawer represented blood spilled on foreign soil for people who would never know his name. Frank had come home from Vietnam to a country that didn't want to hear his stories. He had traded his uniform for work clothes and spent the next 4 decades building houses, fixing cars and raising a family. He never talked about the war, never complained about the nightmares, never asked for special treatment. He had done his job, come home, and lived his life like millions of other veterans who understood that serving your country was its own reward. But time is merciless to everyone, even heroes. Frank's wife had passed 5 years ago, cancer taking her with the same ruthless efficiency that had taken so many of his brothers in arms. His children lived in other states, busy with their own lives, their own problems, their own struggles, to stay afloat in an economy that seemed designed to drown the middle class. His house, the one he had built with his own hands, was too big for one person and too expensive to maintain on a fixed income. So Frank had moved to a small apartment across town, the kind of place where the heat didn't always work and the neighbors played music too loud, and the grocery store trips had become carefully planned expeditions based on sales flyers and coupon calculations. He had gone from being a homeowner to being someone who counted every dollar, from being a provider to being someone who needed help but was too proud to ask for it. The security guard didn't know any of this. He saw what he had been conditioned to see. An old man who didn't belong, who wasn't spending enough money, who was taking up space that could be occupied by younger, more profitable customers. In his 25 years of life, he had never been taught to respect age, to honor service, or to understand that every elderly person had once been young, had once contributed, had once mattered. "I'm calling the police," the guard announced, pulling out his phone with theatrical importance. "You're trespassing and causing a public disturbance." Frank's shoulders sagged, not from the weight of his years, but from the weight of living long, enough to see his country forget what he had fought for. He had watched America change, had seen the gradual erosion of the values he had carried into battle. Respect for elders had become a quaint notion. Honor had become an inconvenience. Service had become invisible. The other shoppers continued to pretend they didn't see what was happening. It was easier that way. Easier to assume the old man deserved it somehow. Easier to believe that if you minded your own business, life would mind its own business with you. They had been trained by decades of urban living to avoid getting involved, to assume that someone else would handle it, to believe that what happened to strangers wasn't their responsibility. But Frank wasn't angry at them. He understood fear, understood the desire to avoid confrontation. He had seen what happened to people who stood up when standing up was dangerous. He had watched good men die because they couldn't walk away from what was right. He knew that courage was rare, and he couldn't blame these people for not having it. What broke his heart wasn't their indifference. It was the realization that he had become invisible. That 60 years of service, of sacrifice, of doing the right thing even when it was hard, had somehow made him disappear. He had become just another old man in the way, just another burden on society, just another problem to be managed or moved along. The police sirens in the distance grew louder, and Frank felt something inside him crumble. Not his spirit, that had been tested by fires much hotter than this, but his faith in the idea that service mattered, that sacrifice was remembered, that a country took care of its defenders. He had been naive to believe that his service would matter when he was no longer strong enough to serve. If you've ever wondered whether respect has an expiration date, whether dignity disappears when hair turns gray, then you need to hear what happened when those police cars arrived. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who have the most to teach us about what really matters. The first police car pulled up with its lights flashing but no sirens, the kind of response reserved for non-emergency situations involving complaints about homeless people or disorderly conduct. Officer Sarah Martinez stepped out, a 10-year veteran of the force who had seen enough domestic disputes and petty complaints to recognize the difference between real problems and manufactured drama. She was expecting the usual scenario: a confused elderly person, maybe someone with dementia, causing a minor disruption that could be handled with patience and a gentle redirect. What she found instead was an old man sitting on the curb, carefully placing canned goods back into a torn paper bag, while a security guard stood over him like a warden supervising a prisoner. "What's the situation here?" Officer Martinez asked. her tone professional but not unkind. The security guard puffed up his chest, ready to deliver his version of events. "This guy's been loitering, causing problems, disturbing customers. I asked him to leave multiple times, and he refused to comply." Officer Martinez looked at Frank, who was still focused on his groceries, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose hands didn't work the way they used to. She had seen this before, the way some people treated the elderly like they were automatically guilty of something just by existing in public spaces. "Sir?" she said, crouching down to Frank's eye level. "Can you tell me what happened?" Frank looked up, and something in his eyes made her pause. She had seen a lot of eyes in her decade of police work. Guilty eyes, lying eyes, angry eyes, scared eyes. But Frank's eyes held something different. They held the weight of someone who had seen too much, done too much, lost too much. They held the quiet dignity of someone who had never expected life to be easy, but had hoped it would be fair. "I dropped my groceries," Frank said simply. "I was trying to pick them up." The security guard interrupted. "He's been here for 20 minutes, just sitting around, making customers uncomfortable." Officer Martinez studied the scene more carefully. The torn bag, the scattered cans, the old man's careful movements. The timeline didn't add up. 20 minutes to pick up groceries from a dropped bag? Frank's hands were shaking more now, not from fear, but from the effort of trying to maintain his composure. He had dealt with authority figures his entire adult life. Military officers, construction supervisors, government bureaucrats. He knew how to follow orders, how to show respect, how to navigate systems that weren't designed with his comfort in mind. "My hands don't work like they used to," he admitted, holding up his gnarled fingers. "Arthritis. Makes everything take longer." That's when Officer Martinez noticed something that made her heart skip. On Frank's wrist, barely visible beneath his flannel sleeve, was a faded tattoo. She couldn't make out all the details, but she could see enough. Military insignia, unit numbers. The kind of ink that told stories about places most people couldn't find on a map. She had grown up in a military family. Her father had served, her brother was currently deployed overseas. She knew how to recognize the signs, the subtle markers, that identified someone who had worn the uniform. The way Frank sat, straight back despite his age. The way he addressed her as ma'am, without thinking about it. The way he waited for permission to speak, rather than interrupting or making demands. "What branch?" she asked quietly. Frank looked surprised. "Ma'am? What branch of service?" The security guard looked confused, suddenly realizing that the conversation had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. Frank's face changed, just slightly. Not with pride exactly, but with recognition that someone had seen him, really seen him, for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Army," he said. "1st Infantry Division, Vietnam, 68 to 70. Officer Martinez felt something shift in her chest. Her father had served in Vietnam, had come home with his own collection of scars and stories he never told. She knew what those years had cost the men who fought in them, knew what it meant when someone like Frank said those words with quiet simplicity instead of boastful pride. "Thank you for your service," she said, and meant it. Frank nodded, the way veterans do when someone acknowledges their sacrifice without making a big show of it. "Just did my job, ma'am." But Officer Martinez was already thinking beyond this moment, already putting together pieces that the security guard couldn't see. A Vietnam veteran, probably dealing with a fixed income, probably struggling with health issues, probably facing the same challenges that thousands of aging veterans dealt with every day. Not a troublemaker, not a threat. Just an old soldier, trying to buy groceries with dignity intact. She stood up and turned to the security guard. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." What happened next would shake everyone present to their core. Because when Officer Martinez made her radio call, she wasn't just requesting backup for a routine disturbance. She was about to set in motion a chain of events that would remind everyone watching that some debts can never be repaid, and some people should never be forgotten. The radio crackled with the familiar static of police communication, but Officer Martinez's voice carried something different when she keyed the microphone. Not the standard codes and procedural language of routine calls, but something more personal, more urgent. Dispatch. This is Unit 23. I'm going to need you to run a background check on someone for me. Frank Morrison, approximately 83 years old. And dispatch. I need you to check military records too. Frank looked up sharply. In his experience, when police officers started running background checks, it meant trouble. It meant questions about things he'd rather not discuss, records he'd rather keep private, a past that he'd spent decades trying to put behind him. The security guard sensed an opportunity. See? There's probably warrants or unpaid fines or something. These old guys always have issues. But Officer Martinez held up a hand, her attention focused on the radio. In the few minutes it took for dispatch to run the check, she helped Frank collect the rest of his groceries, noting how difficult it was for him to grip the cans, how much effort it took for him to stand up from the curb, how his breathing was labored not from exertion, but from what looked like old lung damage. The radio crackled again. Unit 23, this is dispatch. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants. But Martinez, you need to hear this. Frank Morrison, Staff Sergeant, 1st Infantry Division, Purple Heart recipient, Bronze Star with V device for valor, Combat Infantry, badge. Wounded in action during the Tet Offensive. 3 confirmed saves of wounded personnel under fire. The parking lot seemed to go quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Officer Martinez felt her throat tighten. The Bronze Star with V device wasn't handed out for showing up. It was earned by doing things that most people couldn't imagine, in circumstances that most people couldn't survive. Frank's face had gone pale. He had never wanted his service record read out loud in a grocery store parking lot. He had spent his adult life trying to be normal, trying to blend in, trying not to make his war anybody else's burden. The medals in his bedroom drawer were private things, personal reminders of friends who hadn't come home, of choices made in impossible moments. "Sir," Officer Martinez said, her voice thick with emotion she was trying to control. "Sir, I need to ask you something. Did you really save 3 soldiers during Tet?" Frank looked down at his torn grocery bag, at the cans that seemed so heavy now, at his hands that couldn't hold on to the simple things of civilian life. "We all saved each other," he said quietly. "That's what you do." But the radio wasn't finished. Dispatch came back on, and this time the voice was different, more formal, like someone else had taken the microphone. "Unit 23, be advised. Subject Frank Morrison is also listed as MIA, presumed dead for 6 months during 1969 combat operations. Recommended for Medal of Honor by commanding officer. Downgraded to Bronze Star due to lack of witnesses. 3 Purple Hearts total." The security guard's expression had changed completely. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked like dawning horror at what he had done, what he had said, how he had treated someone whose courage he couldn't begin to understand. Officer Martinez was fighting back tears now, thinking of her father's stories, her brother's deployment, the cost that these old soldiers had paid for freedoms that people like the security guard took for granted every day. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know you can say no. Would you be willing to wait here for just a few more minutes?" Frank looked confused. "Am I under arrest?" "No, sir. You're not under arrest. You're not in trouble, but I think some people need to meet you." She keyed her radio again, but this time she wasn't calling dispatch. She was calling directly to her sergeant, then to her lieutenant, then to numbers she had memorized but never thought she'd use for something like this. Within minutes, she had made 6 calls, each conversation brief but intense, each ending with the same promise: "Just get here as fast as you can." Frank sat back down on the curb, not because he was tired, but because he was confused. In his 83 years, he had learned to expect disappointment, had learned that the world didn't owe him anything, had learned that his service was something most people preferred to forget. He had never expected police officers to cry when they heard his name, had never imagined that his old military records could still matter to anyone. The first car to arrive wasn't a police car. It was a pickup truck driven by a man in his 60s, wearing a jacket covered in military patches. He got out slowly, the way people do when their bodies carry old wounds, and walked directly to Frank. "Staff Sergeant Morrison?" he said, and his voice was shaking. I'm Colonel Williams, retired. I served with the Big Red One, 2nd Battalion, about 5 years after you left country. Frank looked up, recognition dawning in his eyes. Not of the man, but of the brotherhood, the shared experience, the understanding that passed between people who had worn the same uniform in the same place during the same impossible time. Colonel, Frank said, trying to stand. Please don't get up, Colonel Williams said, and then he did something that made everyone in the parking lot stop and stare. He knelt down on one knee, right there on the asphalt, and looked Frank in the eye. Sergeant, I've been hearing stories about you for 40 years. What you did during Tet, what you did for those boys. We still tell those stories. You're a legend. Frank's eyes filled with tears. They were good soldiers. They deserved to make it home. Because of you, they did. The silence that followed would haunt witnesses forever. Because in that moment, everyone present understood that they weren't just watching an old man get treated with respect. They were witnessing the recognition of heroism so profound that it had become legend, told and retold by soldiers who understood what it meant to risk everything for someone else. But this was just the beginning. Because when word spreads through the veteran community that a Medal of Honor-worthy hero is sitting on a grocery store curb, holding a torn bag of canned soup, people respond. And when they respond, they don't come alone. The second vehicle to arrive was a police SUV, but it wasn't responding to a call. It was driven by Police Chief Robert Harrison, a man who had served 25 years on the force after serving 8 years in the Marines. He had heard Officer Martinez's radio traffic, had looked up Frank's service record himself, and had made a decision that would define his career. Chief Harrison got out of his vehicle and walked directly to where Frank was, sitting. Without a word, he removed his uniform cap and held it over his heart. Then he stood at attention, right there in the grocery store parking lot, and saluted. It wasn't a casual salute, the kind people give during the national anthem or at parades. It was a military salute, crisp and proper, and held long enough to mean something. It was the salute that one warrior gives to another, the acknowledgement of service and sacrifice and courage that transcends rank and time and circumstance. Frank struggled to his feet, his old body protesting, but his military training overriding his physical limitations. He stood as straight as his 83-year-old spine would allow and returned the salute, his hand trembling not from age but from emotion. The security guard watched this exchange with growing horror at what he had done. He had humiliated. A war hero had treated a Medal of Honor candidate like trash, had pushed around someone who had earned more respect in 2 years of combat than he would earn in his entire lifetime. But the arrivals weren't finished. The third vehicle was a motorcycle, ridden by a man wearing a vest covered in military patches and POW MIA symbols. He was followed by another motorcycle, then another, then a pickup truck full of men wearing Veterans of Foreign Wars caps. Word was spreading through the veteran community with the speed that only comes when brothers are in need. They came from VFW halls and American Legion posts, from retirement homes and assisted living facilities, from jobs they left early and appointments they canceled. They came because Frank Morrison was one of theirs, and one of theirs was in trouble. They came because in the military, you never leave a soldier behind, and that obligation doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Officer Martinez watched in amazement as the parking lot filled with vehicles, pickup trucks with military bumper stickers, cars driven by men and women whose posture and bearing identified them as clearly as if they were still wearing uniforms. Motorcycles ridden by gray-haired veterans whose leather jackets told stories of service in places most Americans couldn't pronounce. They formed a loose circle around Frank, not aggressive or confrontational, but protective. They were there to make sure that what had happened wouldn't happen again, that one of their own would be treated with the dignity he had earned through service and sacrifice. Frank looked around at the faces surrounding him, recognizing the brotherhood, even if he didn't know the individuals. These were his people, the ones who understood what it meant to serve, what it cost to serve, what it felt like to come home to a country that didn't always remember your sacrifice. Colonel Williams helped Frank to his feet and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, United States Army 1st Infantry Division. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, Sergeant Morrison single-handedly held off an enemy assault while evacuating 3 wounded soldiers from a surrounded position. He was wounded twice during the action but refused medical evacuation until all his men were safe. The crowd of veterans began to applaud, but it wasn't the kind of applause you hear at sporting events or political rallies. It was the measured, respectful clapping of people who understood exactly what Colonel Williams was describing, who knew the difference between doing your job and doing something that earned you a place in military history. Frank held up his hand, trying to stop the applause. "Please," he said. "I just did what anyone would have done." But Colonel Williams shook his head. "No, Sergeant, you did what heroes do, and we're here to make sure everyone knows it." The security guard had backed away from the circle, suddenly very interested in his shoes, very aware that he had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. He had picked on the wrong old man, had shown disrespect to someone who deserved more honor than he could imagine. Officer Martinez approached him quietly. "You might want to apologize," she said. I didn't know," he stammered. "That's the problem," she replied. "You didn't know, and you didn't care enough to find out. Do better." But the story wasn't over, because when a community decides to honor a hero, when they decide to right a wrong and restore dignity to someone who has earned it, they don't do it halfway. They do it completely, thoroughly, and in a way that ensures the lesson is learned and remembered. Chief Harrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of his position and the respect due to Frank's service. "Mr. Morrison, on behalf of the City Police Department, I want to apologize for what happened here today. This is not how we treat our veterans, and it's not how we treat our citizens." He turned to address the crowd that had gathered, not just veterans now, but regular shoppers who had stopped to see what was happening, store employees who had come out to witness something unprecedented, and media representatives who had heard about the gathering on police scanners. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chief Harrison announced, "you are looking at a genuine American hero. Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison served our country with distinction during some of the darkest days of the Vietnam War. He saved lives under fire, was wounded multiple times, and came home to build the communities we live in today." The crowd had grown to over 100 people, drawn by the sight of police cars and motorcycles, staying because of the story they were hearing. Frank stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed by the attention, uncomfortable with being the focus of so much praise. Colonel Williams wasn't finished. He had made phone calls while waiting for others to arrive, had reached out to contacts in the military community, had set in motion something that would ensure Frank Morrison's story was properly told and properly honored. "Sergeant Morrison," he said, "I've been in contact with the Veterans Administration, with the Department of Defense, and with your old unit association. Your service record has been reviewed, and there are some people who want to meet with you. Some honors that were never properly presented, some recognition that was lost in the bureaucracy of war." Frank looked confused. "I don't understand." "Your Medal of Honor recommendation was never properly processed. The witnesses were killed or wounded before they could provide statements, and the paperwork was lost in the chaos of combat operations. But we have other records now, other witnesses, other documentation. The Army wants to review your case." The implications hit Frank like a physical blow. The Medal of Honor was the nation's highest military decoration, awarded for valor in action, against enemy forces that went above and beyond the call of duty. It was the recognition that every soldier understood but few ever received. The acknowledgement that what you did mattered not just to your unit or your army, but to your entire country. "I don't need medals," Frank said quietly. "I just needed groceries." But Colonel Williams smiled. "Sergeant, you're going to get both." The crowd began to disperse slowly, but not before dozens of veterans approached Frank individually. They shook his hand, thanked him for his service, shared their own stories, and made sure he knew that he wasn't alone, that he wasn't forgotten, that his sacrifice mattered to them and to the country he had served. The security guard approached, last, his face red with shame and embarrassment. "Mr. Morrison, I want to apologize. I was wrong. I was completely wrong. Frank looked at the young man who had humiliated him just an hour earlier, seeing not an enemy but someone who needed to learn what respect meant, what service meant, what dignity meant. Son, Frank said, we all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them. The security guard nodded, unable to speak, and walked away with a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. As the crowd dispersed and the parking lot returned to normal, Frank found himself sitting in the back of Colonel Williams' pickup truck, his groceries properly bagged and paid for by several veterans who had insisted on covering his bill. Officer Martinez sat beside him, filling out incident reports that would ensure this story was properly documented. Mr. Morrison, she said, I want you to know that what happened here today wasn't just about getting your groceries. It was about something bigger. It was about remembering who our heroes are, about treating them with the respect they've earned, about making sure their service isn't forgotten. Frank nodded, still overwhelmed by the afternoon's events. I never expected any of this. That's what makes you a hero, Officer Martinez replied. Heroes never expect to be heroes. They just do what needs to be done. Chief Harrison approached the truck carrying a business card and a folder full of papers. Mr. Morrison, I've spoken with several veteran service organizations, and they want to help you with whatever you need. Housing assistance, medical care, financial support, anything that can make your life easier. Frank looked at the folder, at the business cards, at the phone numbers of people who wanted to help him, simply because he had served his country 60 years ago. Why now? He asked. Why does anyone care now? Colonel Williams answered. Because we never stopped caring. We just didn't know where you were, didn't know you needed help. But now we do, and we're not going to let you face anything alone. The sun was setting over the grocery store parking lot, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Frank of sunsets he had watched from foxholes and fire-base perimeters decades ago. But this sunset was different. This sunset was peaceful, hopeful, filled with the promise that his remaining years wouldn't be spent in isolation and struggle. As they prepared to leave, Frank looked back at the store where his humiliation had turned into honor, where his invisibility had become recognition, where his loneliness had become brotherhood. He thought about the security guard who had learned an important lesson, about the police officers who had treated him with dignity, about the veterans who had rallied to his side when he needed them most. You know, he said to Colonel Williams, maybe getting old isn't as bad as I thought. Colonel Williams smiled. Sergeant, heroes don't get old, they just get more distinguished. The months that followed would bring changes to Frank Morrison's life that he could never have imagined. The Army did review his case, did award him the medals that had been lost in the chaos of war, did recognize his service with the honor it deserved. The veteran service organizations did help him find better housing, better medical care, better support systems, but more importantly, Frank discovered that he wasn't invisible after all. His story, spread through social media and news reports, reminded Americans that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unappreciated until someone takes the time to see them, really see them, for who they are and what they've done. The security guard, whose name was never released to protect his privacy, underwent sensitivity training and began volunteering at a local veterans center. He learned the names and stories of dozens of aging veterans, and he made sure that none of them would ever be treated the way he had treated Frank Morrison. Officer Martinez was promoted to detective, in part because of her handling of what became known as the grocery store incident. She continued to work with veteran communities, helping to bridge the gap between law enforcement and those who had served their country in uniform. Chief Harrison established new department protocols for interacting with elderly citizens and veterans, training that spread to police departments across the state and eventually across the country. The lesson was simple. Every person has a story, and some stories deserve more respect than others. But perhaps the most important change was in how the community viewed its aging population. Frank's story reminded people that the elderly weren't just burdens to be managed or problems to be solved. They were repositories of history, holders of wisdom, bearers of stories that needed to be heard and honored. Frank Morrison lived 4 more years after the grocery store incident, years filled with recognition and respect. with friendships and fellowship, with the knowledge that his service had mattered and his sacrifice had been remembered. When he passed away at age 87, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including active-duty military personnel, veterans from every branch of service, police officers, firefighters, and ordinary citizens who had heard his story and been inspired by his example. The eulogy was delivered by Colonel Williams, who spoke about courage and service, about sacrifice and honor, about the debt that free people owe to those who defend their freedom. But he also spoke about something else, something that had become Frank's most important legacy. Frank Morrison taught us that heroes aren't just the people who do extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances, Colonel Williams said. Heroes are also the people who do ordinary things with extraordinary character, who serve without expecting recognition, who sacrifice without demanding reward. Frank taught us that every elderly person we see might be a hero in disguise. Every veteran we meet might have stories that would humble us. Every citizen struggling with age and illness might have contributed more to our freedom than we can imagine. The lesson of Frank Morrison's story isn't complicated, but it's profound. In a society that worships youth and dismisses age, that values wealth over service and celebrity over character, it's easy to overlook the heroes who walk among us. It's easy to assume that the trembling hands reaching for groceries have never held anything more important than a shopping list, that the slow steps across parking lots have never carried anyone across battlefields, that the quiet voices asking for help have never shouted orders that saved lives. But if we take the time to look, really look, at the people around us, we might discover that heroes don't wear capes or uniforms or medals on their chests. Sometimes they wear flannel shirts and worn jeans, carry torn grocery bags, and struggle with arthritis that makes simple tasks feel impossible. Sometimes they're the people we overlook, the ones we dismiss, the ones we're too busy or too self-absorbed to notice. Sometimes they're sitting on curbs outside grocery stores, holding their dignity together with the same quiet strength they once used to hold their units together under fire. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, if we have the wisdom to recognize what we're seeing and the courage to act on that recognition, we get the chance to honor them the way they deserve to be honored. We get the chance to say thank you, to show respect, to demonstrate that their service mattered and their sacrifice was not in vain. Frank Morrison's story reminds us that every person has worth, every life has meaning, and every story deserves to be heard. But it also reminds us of something more specific, something that should make every American pause and think about how we treat our veterans, our elderly, our most vulnerable citizens. It reminds us that the freedom we enjoy, the security we take for granted, the prosperity we assume will always be there, was purchased by people like Frank Morrison, people who were young once, who had dreams and plans and futures they were willing to risk for something bigger than themselves. People who came home changed, wounded, aged by experiences that most of us can't imagine and don't want to understand. Those people are still among us. They're in nursing homes and assisted living facilities, in small apartments and mobile homes, in grocery store checkout lines counting coupons and calculating whether they can afford both their medications and their food. They're the invisible army of aging veterans who served their country when it called and who deserve better than indifference when they need help. The next time you see an elderly person struggling with groceries, remember Frank Morrison. The next time you encounter someone who moves slowly, speaks quietly, or seems lost in memories of better days, remember that you might be looking at a hero. The next time you're tempted to dismiss someone because they're old or poor or different from you, remember that some of the most extraordinary people look completely ordinary until you take the time to see them clearly. Because heroes don't stop being heroes when they get old. They just get harder to recognize, easier to overlook, more likely to be forgotten by the very people they once protected. And that's a tragedy we can all help prevent, simply by paying attention, showing respect, and remembering that every person we meet is fighting battles we know nothing about and carrying stories we've never heard. If Frank Morrison's story teaches us anything, it's that dignity doesn't have an expiration date. Service doesn't become irrelevant with age, and heroism doesn't fade just because the hero's hands shake when they try to hold onto a can of soup. In the end, Frank Morrison got more than groceries that day. He got recognition, respect, and the knowledge that his service had mattered to people who understood what service meant. But more importantly, everyone who witnessed his story got something too. They got a reminder of what real heroism looks like, what genuine sacrifice means, and what we owe to the people who gave their best years to protect our worst fears from becoming reality. The grocery store still stands where it always did, on the same corner where Frank Morrison's dignity was stripped away and then restored with interest. But something has changed there, something that regular customers notice even if they can't put their finger on exactly what it is. The staff treats elderly customers with more patience, more respect, more understanding that every person who walks through those doors has lived a life worth honoring. There's a plaque now, small and unobtrusive, mounted near the entrance. It doesn't tell Frank's whole story, doesn't list his medals or describe his service in detail. It simply says, "In honor of Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, United States Army, and all veterans who served with courage and came home to serve with grace." Most people walk past it without reading it, too busy with their own concerns to notice. But some people stop. Some people read. And some people remember. They remember that heroes walk among us, that service deserves recognition, and that the elderly deserve our respect, not just because they're old, but because they've lived through things we can't imagine and contributed to freedoms we take for granted. Frank Morrison's story spread far beyond that grocery store parking lot, far beyond the local news coverage and social media posts that initially brought it attention. It became part of a larger conversation about how we treat our veterans, how we care for our elderly, how we recognize the heroes who hide in plain sight among us. Veterans organizations across the country began sharing similar stories, reminding Americans that every community has its Frank Morrisons, its aging heroes who need recognition and support more than they need pity or dismissal. Police departments implemented new training programs, teaching officers to recognize the signs of military service, to understand the unique challenges faced by aging veterans, to respond with dignity rather than suspicion when called to deal with elderly citizens. Schools began inviting elderly veterans to speak to students, not just on Veterans Day, but throughout the year, sharing stories that textbooks couldn't capture and lessons that only come from lived experience. Children who had never thought much about the elderly people in their neighborhoods began to see them differently, to understand that every wrinkled face might hide stories of courage, every slow step might have once carried someone across a battlefield, every quiet voice might have once shouted orders that saved lives. But perhaps most importantly, Frank's story reminded Americans that heroism isn't a relic of the past, confined to history books and war memorials. It's a living thing, present in every community, visible in every generation if we just take the time to look for it. The qualities that made Frank Morrison a hero in Vietnam, the courage and selflessness and dedication to something bigger than himself, didn't disappear when he came home. They just found new expressions in civilian life, in the houses he built, the community he served, the family he raised, the quiet dignity with which he faced his own struggles. The security guard who had humiliated Frank that day became one of the most vocal advocates for veteran recognition in his community. He spoke at schools and community centers, telling Frank's story and his own, explaining how easy it is to make assumptions about people we don't understand, how dangerous it is to judge someone's worth by their appearance or circumstances. "I thought I was looking at a troublemaker," he would tell audiences, "but I was actually looking at someone who had earned more respect in 2 years of combat than I'll earn in my entire lifetime. I learned that day that heroes don't always look like heroes, and that some of the most important people in our communities are the ones we're most likely to overlook." Officer Martinez continued to work with veteran communities, but she also became an advocate for broader changes in how society treats its aging population. She spoke at police conferences and community meetings, sharing Frank's story and the lessons it taught about dignity, respect, and the hidden histories that every elderly person carries. "We live in a culture that worships youth and dismisses age," she would say. "But age is where wisdom lives, where experience accumulates, where the stories that define our communities and our nation are stored. When we disrespect the elderly, we're not just hurting individuals. We're disconnecting ourselves from our own history, our own heritage, our own future, Chief Harrison's department protocols became a model for law enforcement agencies across the country, proving that it's possible to maintain public safety while also maintaining human dignity. The training programs he developed emphasized that every interaction with the public is an opportunity to build community trust, to demonstrate the values that law enforcement is supposed to protect, to show that serving and protecting means more than just enforcing laws. Colonel Williams continued to visit Frank regularly until Frank's death, bringing other veterans with him, creating an informal support network that ensured no aging veteran in their community would face their challenges alone. After Frank's passing, the network expanded, reaching out to veterans' families, to active duty military personnel, to anyone who understood that service creates bonds that transcend time and circumstance. The story of Frank Morrison and the grocery store incident became required reading in military academies, police training programs, and social work schools across the country. It became a case study in human dignity, a lesson in the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, a reminder that heroism often hides in the most unexpected places. But beyond all the institutional changes, beyond all the training programs, and policy modifications and awareness campaigns, Frank Morrison's story accomplished something more fundamental. It reminded individual Americans to pause before making judgments, to consider the histories hidden behind every face they encounter, to understand that every person they meet is fighting battles they know nothing about and carrying stories they've never heard. It reminded grocery store clerks to be patient with elderly customers who move slowly and count change carefully. It reminded security guards to see protection rather than just enforcement as their primary responsibility. It reminded police officers that every call is an opportunity to serve with honor rather than just respond with authority. It reminded children to listen when elderly relatives tell stories that seem boring or repetitive, understanding that those stories are gifts, treasures passed down from people who lived through experiences that shaped the world their grandchildren inherited. It reminded adults to visit aging parents not just out of obligation, but out of recognition that those parents were once young, vital people who had dreams and adventures and accomplishments that deserve acknowledgement and respect. Most importantly, Frank Morrison's story reminded Americans that the values our country was founded on, the principles our military defends, the ideals our society aspires to achieve, aren't abstract concepts floating somewhere in the ether. They're embodied in real people, living real lives, facing real challenges in communities across the nation. Those values walk among us in the form of aging veterans who served when service was dangerous, who sacrificed when sacrifice was costly, who came home to build the communities we live in, and raise the children who became the citizens we are today. They deserve our recognition not just because they're old, not just because they need help, but because they earned our respect through service that cost them more than we can imagine and gave us more than we can repay. Frank Morrison never wanted to be famous, never sought recognition for his service, never asked for special treatment because of his medals or his wounds or his sacrifice. He just wanted to buy groceries with dignity, to live his remaining years with respect, to be seen as a person rather than dismissed as a problem. But his story became famous because it touched something deep in the American consciousness, something that recognizes heroism when it sees it and understands that the debt we owe to our defenders can never be fully repaid, only acknowledged with the honor and respect they've earned. The next time you're in a grocery store and you see an elderly person struggling with their shopping, remember Frank Morrison. Remember that you might be looking at someone who once held a rifle in defense of freedom, who once carried wounded comrades to safety under fire, who once stood between democracy and those who would destroy it. Remember that heroes don't stop being heroes when their hands shake, when their steps slow, when their voices grow quiet with age. They just become harder to recognize, easier to overlook, more dependent on our willingness to see them clearly and treat them with the dignity they've earned. And remember that every act of respect you show, every moment of patience you offer, every gesture of kindness you extend to someone who seems forgotten or dismissed by society might be the recognition that a hero has been waiting for, the acknowledgement that their service mattered, the proof that their sacrifice was not in vain, because in the end, we're all just people trying to make it through another day with our dignity intact. But some people have paid a higher price for that dignity than others, and those people deserve our recognition, our respect, and our gratitude for as long as they live and long after they're gone. If you believe that service deserves recognition, that sacrifice should be remembered, and that heroes deserve honor regardless of their age, then share this story. Comment below with your own experiences meeting veterans, encountering heroes, or learning lessons about dignity and respect. Because Frank Morrison's story isn't just about one old man and one grocery store incident. It's about all of us, and how we choose to treat the people who made our freedom possible.